There is a specific kind of exhaustion that does not show up in the body. It does not announce itself as tiredness. It does not arrive with obvious symptoms or a clear point of origin. It lives somewhere between the chest and the stomach. A quiet, chronic weight that accumulates over months of giving everything and watching it land as not quite enough. Of softening yourself at every sharp edge so the other person stays comfortable. Of pouring genuine, careful, considered love into a space that somehow always remains slightly empty. That exhaustion is what this is about. Not the dramatic kind of heartbreak. Not the explosive ending. The slow kind. The kind that happens inside a relationship that looks functional from a distance but feels, up close, like running toward a horizon that keeps moving. You love them at their worst, and they could not receive you at your best. And somewhere inside that asymmetry lives one of the most quietly devastating truths about what it means to love an avoidant. Love, when it is genuine, does not arrive with conditions about presentation. It does not require the other person to be performing their highest self at all times. It does not retract when the mood is low, when the behavior is imperfect, when the cracks begin to show in someone's carefully maintained exterior. You understood this. Not as a philosophy, not as something you read and intellectually accepted, but as a lived orientation, a way of being in relation to another person that said, I see the version of you that you are ashamed of, and I am not leaving. That is not a small thing to offer. That is not ordinary love. That is the kind of love that requires a person to have metabolized a significant amount of their own fear, to have looked at their own darkness honestly enough that they no longer flinch when they encounter someone else's. To have built enough interior spaciousness that another person's worst moments do not become their worst moments too. You had that, you brought that, you laid that on the table of this relationship, with both hands, with your full self, with the particular generosity of someone who wanted to love without reservation. And what happened? They received it inconsistently. They received it at the edges. They took the warmth without fully letting it in, the way a person might stand in a doorway to feel the sun without ever stepping outside. And when you arrived at your best, when you were most fully yourself, most grounded, most clear, most alive with the particular energy of someone who has done real work on themselves, something in them shifted, not toward you. Not in the direction of being moved by the fullness of who you were, but away, sideways, into the familiar fog of vague distance and unnameable reasons for pulling back. That is the paradox that lives at the center of loving an avoidant. And it is a paradox that tends to be deeply confusing, deeply destabilizing, deeply personal in the way it lands on the person experiencing it. Because it inverts every intuitive understanding of what love is supposed to respond to. In ordinary logic, more care produces more closeness. More warmth produces more warmth. More genuine presence invites more genuine presence in return. But in the avoidant dynamic, the opposite frequently operates. More depth triggers more distance. More certainty of feeling produces more uncertainty of behavior. More of your best self produces the particular withdrawal of someone who cannot afford to let that much reality in. Let's stay with why. Not to explain it away, not to transform it into something forgivable or manageable, but because the psychology underneath this dynamic is one of the most important things to understand if the confusion of it is ever going to lift. The avoidant did not develop their relational architecture in adulthood. It was not a conscious decision, not a deliberate strategy, not a personality trait they chose from some available menu of ways to be in the world. It was a survival response, built young, built quickly, built because the alternative, remaining open, remaining needing, remaining emotionally visible in an environment that did not reliably meet that visibility with care, was simply too dangerous. Children who grow up in environments where emotional need is met with inconsistency, withdrawal, dismissal, or overwhelm do not have the option of sitting with that experience and intellectually processing it. They adapt. The adaptation is immediate, efficient, and almost entirely unconscious. It takes the form of a shrinking inward, a retraction of the reaching, a reduction of the need, an internal reorganization that says, I will not need what is not available, and I will not show what will not be received. That retraction becomes the template. It becomes the default setting for every subsequent relationship. It is not a choice the adult avoidant makes fresh each time. It is a groove that was worn deep in early experience, and it runs without requiring conscious engagement. Here is where this becomes directly relevant to your experience of loving them. When you showed up at your best, grounded, whole, clear, genuinely present, what you were offering was the exact kind of deep, consistent, genuine emotional attunement that the avoidant never received in the context where their relational patterns were first formed. You were offering something that, at the deepest level of their psychology, was simultaneously the most desired and the most terrifying thing available to them. Desired because every human nervous system, regardless of the defenses built around it, carries the original need for genuine connection. The need does not disappear because it was not met. It goes underground. It becomes encased in protection. But it is there, alive, intact, pressing against the walls of whatever structure was built to contain it. Terrifying because the last time, the original time, that need was this present, this activated, this close to being genuinely met, something went wrong. The environment failed. The attunement was not there. And the psyche, having encoded that failure as the probable outcome of need, now reads genuine potential intimacy as a precursor to genuine potential loss. Your best self did not just offer them love. Your best self activated the full spectrum of what love means to a person who was hurt by its absence. The joy of it and the dread of it simultaneously. And the dread was louder, not because you did anything wrong, but because dread, when it is rooted in early experience, has a volume that later joy cannot easily compete with. And your worst, or rather your more human moments, your moments of imperfection, uncertainty, or need, those they could tolerate. Not because they loved you more in those moments, but because those moments created an asymmetry that felt familiar. A momentary lessening of the pressure of your depth. A brief experience of you as less than fully together, which meant they could briefly position themselves as more together, more in control, less at risk of being the more exposed one in the dynamic. There is something almost unbearably ironic in this. The moments when you were most human, most needing, most uncertain, most soft in the ways that vulnerability makes a person soft, those were the moments the avoidant could move toward you most easily. Not because those moments were the fullest version of you, but because those moments were the easiest version of you for someone with deep attachment, fear to be around. Your need, briefly visible, allowed them to be the steady one, to be the one giving, to be for a moment in the less exposed position. And that position, the position of the one who is slightly less emotionally invested, slightly more in control of the dynamic, is where the avoidant nervous system can actually breathe. Your best self took that position away. Your best self arrived so complete, so settled, so genuinely not needing to be rescued, that there was no role for them to inhabit that allowed them to maintain the emotional upper hand. And without the upper hand, the fear arrived. And with the fear, the distance. What does it do to a person, to you specifically, to be loved more easily in your weakness than in your strength? It distorts things. It creates a quiet, low-level message that is never spoken aloud, but is nonetheless communicated through the pattern of the dynamic. A message that says, the version of you that I can stay close to is the version that needs me. The version of you that stands fully in yourself is the version that makes me leave. That message lands on the receiving end as a kind of subtle conditioning. The person on the other side of this dynamic begins, often without realizing it, to sense that their wholeness is a threat to the relationship. That being too well, too grounded, too settled in themselves is the thing that triggers the distance. And the psyche, being oriented toward connection, begins to wonder whether staying slightly diminished is the price of keeping the person close. This is one of the most insidious qualities of the avoidant dynamic. It does not loudly demand that you be less. It simply rewards your smallness with nearness and your greatness with distance. And the reward and withdrawal pattern is one of the most powerful conditioning mechanisms available. It does not require a rule, it requires only repetition. Over time, without awareness, a person can find themselves quietly softening their own edges, downplaying their certainties, introducing uncertainty where they actually feel clear, becoming, in small, hardly noticeable increments, a slightly lesser version of themselves, not from laziness or apathy, but from the entirely human instinct to maintain a connection with someone they genuinely loved. That is the wound that does not get named enough in these conversations, not the obvious wound of someone who left, or someone who was cold, or someone who never quite showed up. The subtler wound of someone who may have stayed, who may have been physically present, relationally continuing, but whose dynamics slowly, quietly, steadily asked the person loving them to become smaller in order to be held. And you gave. Because that is what love does when it is genuine. It looks for what the other person needs and tries to provide it. When the avoidant needed space, you gave space. When the avoidant needed reassurance, you gave reassurance. When the avoidant went cold, you went patient. When the avoidant pulled away, you found ways to stay available without crowding. All of that adaptation was love. It genuinely was. But it was love operating in a dynamic that could not return it in kind. A dynamic where the giving was structurally one-directional, not because the avoidant was malicious, but because they were at the level of genuine emotional reciprocity, simply not yet capable of sustaining the exchange. There is something that needs to be said clearly here, and it needs to be said without the softening that often accompanies this kind of conversation. You deserved reciprocity. Not perfect reciprocity. Not the impossible standard of two people always giving in exactly equal measure at exactly the same time. But genuine, consistent, effortful reciprocity. The kind that says, I see what you bring to this, I value it, and I am actively trying to meet it with something real. That was not what you received. What you received was the irregular rhythm of someone who could approach when the conditions felt controllable and needed to retreat when they did not. Who could be warm when warmth required nothing of them, and cold when warmth would have required genuine exposure? Who could receive your care in the moments it provided comfort, and resist it in the moments it pressed against the interior of their defended self? You deserved better than that. Not as a consolation, not as something that is said to make the ending easier, as a factual statement about what a person of your depth and sincerity and emotional generosity is owed by anyone who claims to love them. The phrase at the center of this, your worst will be enough for me, but my best will never be enough for you, is one of the most honest expressions of this particular dynamic that exists. And what makes it devastating is not just the imbalance it describes, it is the self-awareness required to articulate it. To say that their worst is enough is to acknowledge a love that was not contingent on performance, a love that had decided without ambiguity that this person was worth staying for even in the difficult moments. That is not naivety or codependency. That is genuine love, the kind that persists through imperfection because it is rooted in something deeper than convenience. And to say that your best is not enough is to sit with one of the loneliest recognitions available to a human being. The recognition that the fullest, most honest, most carefully developed version of yourself, the version you worked to become, the version you arrived at after real struggle and real growth, that version was somehow in this specific dynamic too much to be met. Not because it was actually too much, but because the person receiving it had not built themselves to receive it. The distinction between I am too much and they were not built to hold this is the distinction that changes everything. When a person operates from I am too much, they begin the slow erosion of themselves. They begin the project of becoming less, quieter, less certain, less whole, as a preventative measure against future rejection. They internalize the avoidance response as evidence about their own worth rather than evidence about the avoidance capacity. And that internalization is a wound that operates long after the specific relationship has ended. It shows up in subsequent connections as a preemptive dimming, a habit of making themselves smaller before anyone can ask them to. When a person operates from they were not built to hold this, something different becomes possible. Not immediate healing. Grief is grief, and it takes the time it takes. But the preservation of the self that was brought into the relationship. The refusal to allow someone else's limitation to become a permanent statement about one's own value. The understanding that a glass that is too small is not a verdict on the wine. You were the wine, they were the glass. And the glass was never going to be the right container for what you brought. This is also the moment to look at what the statement reveals about the nature of their fear specifically. An avoidant who can tolerate your worst but retreats from your best is not someone who loves you less when you are thriving. They are someone who fears being displaced by you when you are thriving. Someone whose self-concept is so fragile, so quietly unstable beneath the practiced exterior of self-sufficiency, that being in the presence of your wholeness feels like standing next to something that makes them invisible. This is not a conscious thought. They are not sitting with a deliberate jealousy, not consciously calculating their own inadequacy. But underneath the distance, underneath the cooling, underneath the vague discomfort that descends when you are most fully yourself, lives a wound that says, I do not know who I am next to someone who knows who they are. Your clarity threw their own lack of clarity into sharp relief. Your groundedness highlighted their restlessness. Your self-knowledge sat beside their self-avoidance and simply, without intention, without accusation, by existing, made the contrast visible. And they could not bear the contrast, not because you made them feel small deliberately, but because a person who has not done the work of actually knowing themselves experiences the self-knowingness of another person as a kind of quiet accusation, as evidence of a gap they are not ready to address. What tends to happen in the body of a person who has been in this dynamic for long enough is a particular kind of emotional vigilance, a hyper-awareness of the other person's temperature. A constant, low-level monitoring of what the avoidant needs, what mood they are in, what version of approach is most likely to be received today, what might trigger the withdrawal, and what might, briefly, invite the warmth. This vigilance is exhausting, and it is so normalized within the dynamic that the person living inside it often does not register it as vigilance at all. It becomes the ambient condition of the relationship, the background noise. The constant, taxing work of loving someone whose emotional availability is always slightly out of reach and slightly dependent on factors that have nothing to do with what you are actually offering. And the coolest part is that this vigilance is also in its own way an expression of love. It comes from the genuine desire to understand the person, to meet them where they are, to find the angle of approach that allows the real connection to happen, that opens the door the avoidant keeps finding reasons to close. But love should not require that degree of surveillance. It should not demand a constant recalibration of self in order to remain tolerable to the other person. It should not require the loving party to become so attuned to another's fluctuations that they lose the thread of their own interior life in the process. That is what the avoidant dynamic can slowly do, not through a single dramatic moment, through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small adjustments. Here is the thing about your best that the avoidant could not receive, and this is perhaps the most important thing. Your best was not a performance. It was not the curated presentation of someone managing their image or strategically deploying their best qualities to create a favorable impression. Your best was simply your most honest self, your most integrated self. The version of you that has been through enough to have earned a certain quietness, a certain knowing, a certain stability that does not require external confirmation to maintain its shape. That version of you, that unhurried, unperformed, genuine fullness, that was what they could not hold. And they could not hold it, because holding it would have required something of them. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic act of courage, but the quiet, sustained willingness to be equally present, to bring an equal quality of realness, to stop managing the distance and actually stand inside the relationship without the exit always pre-calculated. That willingness was not available to them. It may become available to them somewhere down the road with enough time and enough honesty and enough of the right support. But in this season, with you, it was not available. And so your best met their defense, and the defense won. And you were left holding the weight of having offered everything and having it be returned, not as rejection, exactly, but as something almost more confusing, as more than they could carry. Something needs to be said about the particular quality of grief that belongs to this kind of ending. It is not clean. It rarely arrives with the clarity of a single moment where everything became obvious, where the truth was stated plainly and the ending followed logically from that truth. It arrives in fragments, in the gradual accumulation of moments where something felt slightly off, where the warmth was slightly less warm than the situation warranted, where the closeness was slightly less close than the intimacy implied, where the love that was being expressed was somehow not quite landing in the space between you as something mutual and alive. It arrives as the slow recognition that you have been loving forward, that you have been investing in a potential that kept promising to become present but never quite arrived. That the relationship you were in and the relationship you were hoping for were two different things, and you had been quietly, persistently confusing them. That grief has a specific shape. It grieves not just the person, but the version of the relationship that you held in your chest as a possibility. The version where the avoidant finally let the defense down long enough for something real to grow. The version where your best was met with their best, where the love you were capable of giving was matched by a love equally capable of receiving it. That version was real to you. It was not delusion or fantasy. It was a genuine reading of something that was latent in the dynamic, a potential that was there, however inaccessible. And grieving its absence is entirely appropriate. It was something worth grieving. But here is also what is true, and it is important to let this land somewhere that is not abstract. You are still here. The version of you that loved so fully, that extended such genuine care, that refused to make the love contingent on performance, that version of you did not get consumed by this. It is still intact, still present, still capable of the same quality of loving. That is not a small thing after a dynamic that could have, over time, taught you to love less, to give less, to arrive at relationships with your hands already slightly closed against the possibility of loss. The fact that your capacity for genuine love survived this dynamic, survived it without becoming cynicism, without becoming strategy, without calcifying into the very thing you were trying to love through in the other person, that is evidence of something extraordinary in your character. The avoidant did not break what is most essential in you. They could not. What they did was create the conditions for you to discover how durable it is. Your worst was enough for them, and what that actually says, stripped of the pain of the dynamic, is that you are capable of a love that did not require the other person to be anything other than what they were. A love that extended toward the full human complexity of someone, including the parts that were difficult, unhealed, defended, and sometimes unkind. That capacity is not a liability. It is not proof of someone who loves too easily or expects too little. It is proof of someone who loves from a place of genuine security, from the understanding that love is not a reward for good behavior, but a choice made in full view of the entire person. The right person will not need to be loved at their worst. They will not arrive in your life requiring the breadth of that particular forgiveness as a prerequisite for the connection to function. But they will know, somehow, that you are capable of it. They will feel the depth of that capacity in how you show up, in the quality of your presence, the steadiness of your care, the particular warmth of someone who has chosen love not because it was easy, but because it was true. And that depth will not frighten them. It will not activate a defense. It will not produce distance as its answer. It will be met. That is what your best deserves, not the retreat of someone who was overwhelmed by you. Not the managed distance of someone who could only approach you safely when you were momentarily less than yourself, but the full, steady, genuine presence of someone who looks at everything you bring and feels not threatened but found. The avoidant could not be that person. Not here, not now, perhaps not for a long time. That is not a reflection of what you are worth. That is a reflection of where they are. And where they are is no longer your address. You gave them your presence at its most generous. You gave them a love that did not flinch at their difficulty. You gave them the rare and valuable experience of being seen in their worst and not abandoned, and what you received in return was the slow, quiet lesson that generosity alone cannot build a bridge that only one person is willing to stand on. The bridge needed two. It always needed two, and it is not your fault that you were the only one who showed up with materials. There is a moment that tends to arrive quietly, usually not in the middle of the relationship, but somewhere after the dust has begun to settle. A moment where the person who loved the avoidant sits with the full picture of what they gave and feels something that is not quite anger, not quite sadness, but something that lives in the territory between the two. It is the feeling of having been witnessed without being valued, of having been seen, genuinely seen because the avoidant did see you, that part was real, and having that seeing not translate into the kind of care and consistency that sight is supposed to produce in someone who genuinely wants another person. Being seen without being chosen is its own specific wound. It does not behave like ordinary rejection. Ordinary rejection carries the possibility of the consolation that the other person simply did not understand who you were, that if they had known you more fully, the outcome might have been different. But when someone sees you, truly, accurately, with a clarity that occasionally startled both of you, and still retreats, still manages the distance, still chooses the safety of their defended interior over the risk of genuine contact with you, that consolation is not available. They knew, they saw, they chose otherwise, and that is the specific brief that tends to sit the longest. The avoidance awareness of who you were did not protect you from their pattern. That is one of the hardest things to absorb. Intelligence does not override attachment architecture. Genuine feeling does not automatically dismantle a defense system. The avoidant could have a clear, accurate, even admiring perception of your depth and your strength, and your particular quality of presence. And that perception could coexist entirely uncomfortably with the behavioral pattern of pulling away. Because the pulling away was never about their assessment of you, it was about their tolerance of themselves in your proximity. Those are two fundamentally different things. When they retreated, they were not retreating from you as a verdict on your character. They were retreating from the version of themselves that being with you required them to inhabit. The more seen they felt by you, the more visible their own interior became to them, and for someone whose entire survival architecture was built on the premise of not looking too closely at what lives inside, that visibility was intolerable. You became, in moments, a mirror they could not look away from. And rather than sit with the reflection, they found reasons to leave the room. That dynamic has a particular effect on the person doing the loving that does not receive enough attention. Because when someone retreats from you not because of who you are, but because of what you illuminate in them, the exit does not come with an explanation that makes that distinction clear. It comes with distance, with cooling, with the particular ambiguity of an avoidant departure, which tends to arrive as a kind of gradual dimming rather than a clean break. And in the absence of clarity, the human mind fills the space with the nearest available explanation. And the nearest available explanation is almost always about the self. What did I do? What did I say? What version of myself was too much, or not enough, or wrong in some way I cannot identify? That internal questioning is not weakness. It is the entirely natural response of a person trying to make sense of a situation that was presented to them without the context they needed to understand it accurately. When someone you love creates distance without honest explanation, the mind searches for causality. And it tends to search inward first, because inward is where the most information is available. But the search was pointed in the wrong direction. The answer was never inside you. The answer was inside them, in the unresolved fear, in the untouched wound, in the long-standing agreement they had made with themselves, that genuine intimacy was a risk the potential reward could never justify. Here is something about the phrase, "Your worst will be enough for me," that carries more weight than it might initially appear to. It is not just a statement about tolerance, it is a statement about a fundamental philosophical orientation toward love. It is the expression of someone who has understood, through experience, through reflection, through the particular education that only genuine loss can provide, that love is not a performance space, that the people worth building something with are not the ones who only show up beautifully, that the truest measure of a connection is not how it feels when everything is easy, but how it holds when things are genuinely hard. To arrive at that understanding and carry it into a relationship is an act of considerable courage, because it means showing up without the protection of conditional love. It means saying implicitly, through the quality of your presence, I am not here for the version of you that has everything together. I am here for the full range. And that openness, that refusal to love only the curated presentation of another person, is one of the most vulnerable positions available in a relationship. You took that position, you offered that quality of love. And the avoidant, rather than receiving it as the gift it was destabilized by it. Because unconditional presence from another person, the genuine kind, not the performed kind, directly confronts the avoidant's core belief that love is always conditional, that it will always be withdrawn eventually, that the safest bet is to withdraw it first. Your refusal to withdraw it did not comfort that belief, it threatened it. Because a belief that has been organizing someone's entire relational life since childhood does not dissolve in the presence of contradictory evidence. It intensifies its defense. The avoidant needed you to eventually confirm what they already believed. They needed at some level for the love to have conditions. For there to be a point at which your generosity ran out, your patience expired, your warmth finally cooled in the face of their unavailability. Not because they consciously wanted you to give up on them, but because your persistence in loving them, without that withdrawal, kept pressing against a belief system that their entire sense of safety was built around. Every time you stayed, something in them became more unsettled. Not grateful, though gratitude may have visited briefly, unsettled, because if the love does not leave, the fear cannot be trusted. And if the fear cannot be trusted, the entire defensive structure begins to feel less justified. And if the defensive structure feels less justified, the person has to sit with the question of what they have been protecting themselves from all this time, and whether the cost of that protection has been greater than the cost of the wound they were protecting against. That is an enormous, life-reorganizing question. Most avoidants, when they brush up against it, do not sit with it. They find a way to make the question unnecessary, and the most efficient way to make it unnecessary is to create the distance that makes the love eventually conditional after all. Which is to say, they push until the pushing produces the result they were bracing for. Not always consciously, but with a consistency that, once seen, is unmistakable. And the tragedy in that, for you, is that you were not built to give up easily. Your love was not the kind that runs on a timer, that has a fixed amount of patience before it converts into resentment or withdrawal. You loved with the particular endurance of someone whose care was rooted in something real, something chosen, something that had decided the other person was worth the difficulty. And that endurance, that very quality that made your love extraordinary, was also the quality that allowed the dynamic to continue longer than it perhaps should have. Not because your love was wrong, but because genuine love in an avoidant dynamic can function unintentionally as the thing that enables the pattern to sustain itself. Your consistency gave them something to rest against without requiring them to grow. Your patience provided the pressure release that allowed the discomfort of their own defended state to remain manageable. This is not your fault. It is not a failure of judgment or a lack of self-respect. It is what happens when someone with a genuine capacity for love meets someone whose relational structure requires exactly that quality of care to keep functioning without change. The question that tends to arise here, and it is worth meeting directly rather than skirting, is whether loving someone at their worst, as completely and consistently as you did, was ultimately a form of self-abandonment. And the honest answer is, it depends on whether you lost yourself in it. Loving someone at their worst from a place of genuine security is an act of grace. It is the expression of a self that is so internally grounded that it can extend generously without depleting. That can hold space for another person's difficulty without making that difficulty the organizing principle of one's own interior life. That can witness imperfection with compassion without requiring the other person to be perfect in order to feel safe in the connection. But loving someone at their worst from a place of fear, fear of losing them, fear of the silence, fear of what it would mean to acknowledge the dynamic for what it was, that is a different thing. That is love as survival strategy. Love as preemptive appeasement. Love given not from abundance, but from the anxiety that withholding it would accelerate the loss. Only you know which of those was more present. And the honest answer is probably that both were present at different times, in different proportions, shifting with the rhythm of the dynamic itself. Because that is how it tends to work. The love starts from the genuine place, and as the pattern repeats and the inconsistency accumulates, it gradually acquires the qualities of the second, the performing quality, the fear-adjacent quality, the quality of someone working very hard to maintain something that should not require that much work to sustain. The moment that distinction becomes clear, the moment a person can feel the difference between the love they started with and the love they ended up performing, is often the beginning of the actual reckoning with the dynamic. Not the reckoning about the avoidant, the reckoning about the self, about what was being sought in that connection that made the imbalance tolerable for as long as it was, about what familiar feeling the dynamic was echoing however painfully, about the ways in which the avoidance pattern may have resonated with something already known from an earlier time in life. This is not about blame, not about finding a way to make the pain your responsibility rather than theirs, but about the full picture, about seeing the whole thing clearly enough that the lessons it contains can actually be absorbed rather than repeated. Because here is what tends to be true of people who loved an avoidant with the depth and sincerity and endurance that you brought to this. They are not people without self-awareness. They are, in many ways, deeply self-aware. But self-awareness and healed attachment patterns are not the same thing. A person can know themselves very well and still be drawn to dynamics that recreate the particular emotional texture of early unmet needs, can recognize the pattern intellectually while the nervous system continues to find the familiar intensity of it compelling in ways that bypass the intellect entirely. Recognizing that is not a diminishment of what you felt. The love was real, the connection was real, the specific gravity of what existed between you was real, even when it was painful, even when it was insufficient, even when it was asking more of you than it was returning. But real does not mean right, and intense does not mean aligned. And the fact that something produced genuine feeling does not mean it was producing genuine health. What the avoidant offered you in their best moments was a glimpse of what it might feel like to be genuinely met, close enough to the real thing that the nervous system registered it as arrival, while the pattern underneath kept ensuring that the arrival was always temporary, always qualified, always subject to the retraction that the avoidance fear demanded. That glimpse was enough to keep hope alive. It was not enough to build a life on. What you deserved, what you have always deserved, and what the fullness of what you offered makes undeniably clear, was someone for whom your best was not a weight to be managed, but a frequency to be matched. Someone whose response to the depth of your love was not retreat, but the particular forward leaning of a person who recognizes something rare and moves toward it with intention. Not someone who needed you to be slightly broken in order to feel safe beside you. Not someone whose proximity to your wholeness activated a fear response that the relationship was never resourced enough to resolve. But someone who arrived at their own wholeness through their own journey and could therefore stand beside yours without feeling diminished, threatened, or overwhelmed by the contrast. That person exists. not as an abstraction, not as a hypothetical comfort offered to soften the grief of this ending, as a real, specific possibility toward which everything you have developed, every quality of character, every depth of understanding, every scar that became wisdom, is pointed. The avoidant could not be that person. Their worst was something you could hold. Your best was something they could not. And in that asymmetry lives the entire explanation for why this had to end, and why its ending, however painful, was not a closing but a clearing. The space that their departure left is not an absence. It is a room being prepared for something that finally, genuinely deserves to be in it.